Greetings! This is part 4 of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers from the turn of the 20th century. The History of Tammany Hall, showing you that right from the start, political corruption was rampant in God-breathed America. Sure, God breathed, right? That's why we genocided the Native American Indians. That's why our Capitol building is completely pagan in its architecture. Phallic symbols. Female goddess fertility rite symbols in the buildings. The Capitol Dome and Washington Monument and... what the people don't know, it's just all rejected knowledge. That's why secret societies proliferate in the nation and always have. Rejected knowledge. Well, this just shows you the history of Tammany Hall, how utterly corrupt, right from the start, that America was politically, and how politics is always going to be corrupt, and Christians, real Christians, can extrapolate easily from that. The conclusion that we don't belong in politics. That's a circus sideshow distraction to us. A very evil one, very dangerous one, but we don't belong there. It's up to us to tell people about what Christ did. And to tell people to come out of her, my people. To reprove evil. Reprove wickedness. And know that what we're dealing with ultimately is wickedness in awfully high places. Temporal, secular high places. But that's what we're dealing with. Anyway, Rejected Knowledge, that's the show. And the book is The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. Part 4 begins with Chapter 10, The Working Men's Party, 1829 to 1830. In 1829, the indignation against the Tammany leaders crystallized in a quote-unquote purifying movement. Under the direction of its banker, merchant, and lawyer leaders, Tammany Hall had been made a medium for either coercing or bribing the legislature or the Common Council into passing dozens of bank charters and franchises with scarcely any provision for compensation to either state or city. In 1819, the Tammany Society, in one of its pompous addresses, had recited the speculative spirit and consequent distress brought about by the multiplication of incorporated banks, and suggested that the legislature adopt a prompt and decisive remedy tending to the abolition of those institutions. This sounded well, but at that very time, as before and after, the sachems were lobbying at Albany for charters of banks of which they became presidents or directors. By one means or another, these banks yielded fortunes to their owners, but the currency issued by them almost invariably depreciated. The laboring classes, on whom this bad private money was imposed, complained of suffering severely. Each year, besides, witnessed an increase in the number of chartered monopolies, armed with formidable powers for long periods, or practically in perpetuity. To the First Gas Company, in May 1823, the Common Council had granted the exclusive right to light all the streets south of Grand Street for 30 years, without returns of any kind to the city. At the rate at which the city was expanding, this was a concession of immense value, and formed one of the subjects of complaint in 1829. While laws were instituted to create a money aristocracy, the old debt and other laws bearing on the working classes were not changed. No attempt was made to improve a condition which allowed a dishonest contractor to put up a building or a series of buildings, collect his money, and then swindle his laborers out of their wages. The local administration, moreover, continued corrupt. It was freely charged at this time that $250,000 of city money was being stolen outright every year. The city charter drafted and adopted in 1829 to 1830 contained provisions which, it was thought, might remedy matters. It created two bodies of the Common Council, the aldermen and assistant aldermen, and gave each a negative upon the propositions of the other, vesting a supreme veto power in the mayor. It again separated the election of the Common Council from the general election. It abolished secret contracts and compelled all resolutions involving appropriations of public money or placing taxes or assessments to be advertised, and included other precautionary measures against corruption. But it opposed the public wish in still vesting the appointment of the mayor in the Common Council. To battle against the prevailing injustices, the Mechanics' or Working Men's Party was formed. Its chief inspiration was Robert Dale Owen, son of the famous Robert Owen. Dale Owen, as he was familiarly known, and others, had recently returned to the city after an unsuccessful experiment at cooperative colonizing at New Harmony, Indiana, and a number of bright and ardent intellects gathered about him, boldly declaring against the private and exclusive possession of the soil and against the hereditary transmission of property. The new party won over a large part of the laboring element. Quote-unquote, resolved, ran its resolutions, adopted at Military Hall, October 19th, 1829, quote, in the opinion of this meeting, that the first appropriation of the soil of the state to private and exclusive possession was eminently and barbarously unjust, that it was substantially feudal in its character, inasmuch as those who received enormous and unequal possessions were lords, and those who received little or nothing were vassals. That hereditary transmission of wealth on the one hand, and poverty on the other, has brought down to the present generation all the evils of the feudal system, and that, in our opinion, is the prime source of all our calamities, unquote. I'm going to disagree with that. This is just me talking now. Your prime source of calamity is the doing away with of the Jubilee year. The Lord God, He wanted children to inherit from their fathers, inherit the land. But every 50 years, all debts were canceled. There would be no Rockefellers, there would be no lords anywhere. There would be no Mellons and Carnegies and DuPonts, no dynasties. And that's the real government in America. There would be none of that with a Jubilee year. And if you abide by the other laws of the Lord, no usury, no unjust weights and measures, there's your real prime source of calamity. But these guys were, of course, the forerunners of communism, so they want it their way, not the Lord's way. Continuing. After declaring that the Working Men's Party would oppose all exclusive privileges, monopolies, and exemptions, the resolutions proceeded, quote, We consider it an exclusive privilege for one portion of the community to have the means of education in colleges, while another is restricted to common schools, or perhaps, by extreme poverty, even deprived of the limited education to be acquired in those establishments. Our voice, therefore, should be raised in favor of a system of education which shall be equally open to all, as in a real republic it should be." Unquote. The banks, too, came in for a share of the denunciation. The bankers were styled, quote, "the greatest knaves, impostors, and paupers of the age," unquote. The resolutions continued, quote, "As banking is now conducted, the owners of the banks receive annually of the people of this state not less than $2 millions in their paper money," parentheses, and it might as well be pewter money, end parentheses, "for which there is and can be nothing provided for its redemption on demand," unquote. Now you're getting closer to the real source of your calamity. Unjust weights and measures. Now you're getting to it. Now you're on the right track. Continuing. The working men put a full ticket in the field. Tammany Hall, dominated by some of the same men and interests, denounced by the Working Men's Party, opened a campaign of abuse. Commercial and banking men outside the wigwam joined ardently in the campaign. The new movement was declared to be a mushroom party, led by designing men whose motives were destructive. To display its devotion to the cause of democracy, Tammany Hall celebrated, on November 26th, the Revolution in France. It persuaded former President James Monroe to preside in Tammany Hall at the preliminary arrangements and made a studied parade of its zeal. There was a procession, Samuel Swartwout acting as Grand Marshal. Monroe, in a feeble state of health, was brought in a stage to Washington Square, where for 10 minutes he looked on. A banquet, the usual high-flown speeches and fireworks followed. The election was favorable to Tammany. About 3,800 working men who had supported the independent movement the previous year went back to Tammany because of its advocacy of the mechanics' lien law. The average Tammany plurality was 3,000. The real working men's ticket polled a vote of about 2,200. The Clay working men's ticket a little above 7,000, and the agrarian 116. For the next few years, the contest of Jackson with the United States Bank drew together the energies of all Democrats supporting him. Dropping local contests, they united to renew his power. For the time, the working men's movement ceased to exist. Chapter 11. Tammany and the Bank Contest, 1831-1834. Tammany lost no time in announcing its intention to support the renomination of Jackson. The General Committee, on March 3, 1881, unanimously passed a resolution approving of his renomination by the Democratic members of the legislature. 7 days later, the General Committee of Democratic young men and the ward committees acted likewise. Since the campaign of 1800, there had not been a presidential contest in which the masses joined with such enthusiasm. Although the national election was more than 18 months distant, the excitement was intense. The late Working Men's Party and Tammany men fraternized. The ward resolutions were full of fire, the meetings spirited. The Democratic electors of the 6th Ward, quote, friendly to regular nominations, unquote, resolved on March 15th, quote, that aristocracy in all its forms is odious to us as democratic Republicans, and that of all aristocracies, an aristocracy of wealth, grinding the faces of the poor and devouring the substance of the people, is the most alarming. That we regard an incorporated association of rich men wielding the whole moneyed capital of the country as dangerous to our rights and liberties. That we consider the next presidential election as substantially a contest between the people on one side and the moneyed aristocracy of the country on the other, unquote. The organization's first object was to gain a majority of the local offices in the spring election of 1831 on the Jackson issue. The National Republican Party, recently organized in New York City on the same general lines as Tammany Hall, and headed by Clarkson Crolius, a former Grand Sachem, set out to crush the Jackson movement. If a defeat could be administered to it at this time, the practical effect would be great. New York would possibly influence the entire Union. To accomplish this, the National Republicans tried to divert the issue to local lines and agitated for the election of the mayor by the people. The Tammany men joined issue at once, and in February it keeps saying 1881, and that's got to be wrong. I mean, that's Garfield's presidency time, right? This has got to be 1831. Man. In February 1831, the Common Council Committee on Application, composed chiefly of Tammany men, reported adversely on a motion to suggest to the legislature a revision of the charter. The time was declared to be inexpedient for such an innovation, one Tammany alderman, Thomas T. Woodruff, declaring, when the matter again came up on April 8th, that the people could not be trusted with the choice of that important official. The National Republicans replied by denouncing the Common Council for its lavish expenditures of public money, its distribution of favors in the shape of quote-unquote jobs and contracts among a few retainers whose sole merits lay in their close relationship to certain managing members of the board, and for its efforts to prevent the people from having the right to elect their own mayor. The opposition to Tammany was ineffectual. In the ensuing election, not less than 22 of the 28 members chosen for the new double-chamber Common Council were Tammany men, elected solely upon their pledge of allegiance to the national and state administrations. The first trial of the new charter, therefore, showed that the separation of municipal from general elections did not prevent the division of the voters on national party lines. The extent of this preliminary Jackson victory made a sensation throughout the Union and caused gloom among the United States bank supporters. The prestige of Tammany Hall was now overwhelming. Its influence upon the Democratic Party, great before, became greater. No aspirant for public favor could ignore its demands and decrees. When, on May 12th, the Society held an imposing celebration of the 42nd anniversary of its founding, politicians from the highest to the lowest, national and local, 400 and over, crowded there with words of flattery. Lewis Cass, Nathaniel P. Talmadge, the governor and lieutenant governor of the state of New York, members of the National Senate and the House of Representatives. These and the rest were glad to avail themselves of the invitation. William Mooney was there, very old and feeble, beaming with pride at the power of the institution he had founded. After the banquet, which was described in the old Indian terms as consisting, quote, of the game of the forest, the fish of the lakes, the fruits of the season, and the waters of the great spring, unquote, came the reading of letters. Jackson wrote, quote, "Nothing could afford me greater gratification than to participate with your ancient and honorable society of Republicans on such an occasion," unquote. But that press of official duties kept him away. A letter of regret in high-flown and laudatory diction from Secretary of State Martin Van Buren followed. James Watson Webb proposed this toast, quote, "Martin Van Buren, the grand sachem of the Eagle tribe, the Great Spirit is pleased with his faithful support of the great grand sachem of the nation, and smiles graciously upon the sages and warriors of the tribe who aim to elevate their chief in 1836 to the highest station in the country," unquote. This was greeted by 9 cheers, and instantly disclosed Tammany's choice for Jackson's successor in 1836. No wonder Martin Van Buren became president. The only troublous note was furnished by Duff Green, who sprang this toast upon the surprised gathering, quote, "DeWitt Clinton, his friends honor his memory, his enemies dare not assail it," unquote. By quote-unquote enemies, he referred to those present. They retorted that he was an intruder, was not invited, and had not paid for his ticket. Mayor Bown was then installed as Grand Sachem in place of Stephen Allen, the former mayor. The fall election of 1831 also turned upon national issues. Upon Jackson's popularity, nearly every Democratic candidate in New York City was elected by an average majority of 6,000. There were rumors of illegal voting, but no proof was submitted. The wigwam was so overjoyed at the result that a banquet was held on November 21st, presided over by Benjamin Bailey, who, for a dozen years, had been chairman of the General Committee. He had reached his 72nd year and could claim little political influence. But as a captain in the Revolutionary Army, and as one of those confined in the Jersey prison ships, the Tammany chiefs considered him a valuable figurehead. General Wool, Colonels Twiggs and Croghan, and 500 men of various importance spent the night in the wigwam drinking to Jackson, to Tammany Hall, and to coming victory. Not only did Tammany take the initiative in supporting Jackson, but it was the first body to nominate Van Buren for vice president. On the news of the Senate's rejection of Van Buren as minister to England, an indignation meeting was held in Tammany Hall, January 30th, 1832, this being the opening expression of public opinion. Van Buren was suggested for vice president, and the wigwam gathering showed its satisfaction by repeated cheers. 24 leading Tammany men drew up a letter containing their sentiments on Van Buren's rejection, and on May 31st, an outpouring in the wigwam approved his nomination. Then followed a striking revelation, showing the venality of some of Tammany's leaders. The United States bank officials began bargaining for the betrayal of Jackson. The Courier and Inquirer suddenly abandoned him for the support of the bank candidates, giving as a reason the fear of the, quote, fearful consequences of revolution, anarchy, and despotism, unquote, which assuredly would ensue if Jackson were re-elected. The real reason was that Webb and Noah, as revealed by a congressional investigation, had borrowed directly and indirectly $50,000 from the United States Bank, which had now called them to time. Mayor Bowen was their sponsor to Nicholas Biddle, head of the bank. Some of the other Tammany leaders, it appeared, had been for years the bank's retainers. Representative Churchill C. Camberlain enjoyed a place on its payrolls. Julian C. Verplanck, another of the Wigwam's representatives in Congress, had voted in its behalf, and Stephen Allen, in the state Senate, had voted for a resolution in its favor. Peter Sharp, Ogden Edwards, William H. Ireland, John Morse, all influential men in times past, now vigorously opposed Jackson, and the services of other Tammany chiefs were secured. Two influences, however, prevented the organization leaders from betraying the Democratic cause. One, the common people, the other, the owners of the state banks, whose self-interest called for the speedy downfall of the United States Bank. Finding that they could not control the Wigwam, the Tammany agents of that bank seceded and joined the National Republicans. The state bank men remained in the organization and labored for Jackson with no other idea than that their institutions would benefit in the distribution of government funds if the United States Bank were put down. The course of the leaders remaining in Tammany smacked of double-dealing. Refusing to renominate Verplanck, they put in his place Dudley Selden, who had borrowed $8,000 from the United States Bank, but who had professed to support Jackson's veto. It looked as though certain potent influences were operating in Tammany Hall for the election of a pro-bank Congress, whoever might be chosen president. The Tammany ward organizations, assisted by the men of the late Working Men's Party, appointed vigilance committees to undo any mischief the leaders might attempt, and to electioneer for Jackson's success. So enthusiastic was the Jackson feeling that many politicians of note, understanding its depth and having a care for their political futures, made haste to change front. Almost daily the people were rallied to the Wigwam by the beating of drums. A few years before, a hickory tree had been planted in front of the Wigwam. Now, on October 30th, a second was put there, and a barrel of beer was used to moisten its roots. Both sides were guilty of election frauds. Ha ha ha! Here we go again. Same as today, and you vote why? Continuing. Votes were bought at the rate of $5 each. This is in 1832, folks. 1832. How bad do you think voter fraud is now? Huh? Those of you who think. Votes were bought at the rate of $5 each, most of the buying being done by the National Republicans, who were supplied with abundant resources. The National Republicans, moreover, had sought to bribe certain men with the promise of offices, and on the 3 election days they foisted upon the voters a Jackson electoral ticket containing 43 names instead of the legal number 42, thereby invalidating each of these ballots voted. This trick, it was calculated, lost to Jackson more than 1,000 votes. Of a total of 30,474 votes, Tammany carried the city by 5,620 majority. The wigwam for many successive nights was filled with celebrating crowds. Jackson gave a conspicuously public display of his recognition of Tammany's invaluable services when, on the evening of June 13, 1833, he visited the society, attended by the Vice President, Secretary Woodbury, Governor William L. Marcy, the Mayor, and the members of the Common Council. The United States Bank supporters did not surrender with Jackson's re-election. They exerted themselves to influence Congress by means of a defeat for the anti-bank forces in New York City in the fall election of 1833. Tammany Hall, during the campaign, sent out runners ordering every officeholder to his electioneering post. Vigorous meetings were held, and all the secret influences of the General Committee were employed. On the other hand, merchants laid aside their ruffled shirts and broadcloth coats, put on their roundabouts, and worked at the polls on the 3 election days for the Whig ticket. Tammany carried the city by between 2,000 and 3,000 majority. Touching this and previous elections, a committee of assistant aldermen reported on February 10, 1884, quote, that frauds have been practiced at the polls. The committee are convinced. At any rate, a universal and deep conviction prevails among our citizens that tricks have been resorted to for the purpose of defeating the election of one candidate and securing that of another, unquote. Gee, you think? It was further set forth that persons were brought up to vote who were not citizens of the United States, nor qualified to vote in the state. Others voted in more than one ward. Voters also were transferred overnight from a sure to a doubtful ward. Look at all these clever little cunning, deceitful ways of voter fraud they had already mastered in the early 1800s. No remedy followed the report. Of course not. The spring election of 1834, though local, again turned upon national issues. For the first time in the history of the city, the mayor was to be elected by the people. The growth of public opinion had been such that the legislature was forced, in 1833, to grant this reform. The contending hosts were swayed, first, by the question of the United States Bank, and second, by the spoils. The merchants shut their shops and sent their whole body of clerks and laboring men to surround the polls and influence voters against Tammany Hall. The United States Bank spread abroad the cry of, quote-unquote, panic. If its directors could show that public opinion in the foremost city in the Union had altered so as to favor the continuation of the bank charter, then they could use that as a good basis for influencing Congress. There was no concealment of coercion of voters. The weak, the timid, the fearful were overawed by the increasing clamor of paid newspapers that the destruction of the United States Bank meant, quote, widespread revulsion of trade and everlasting injury to the poor, unquote. In fact, a general depression of business was produced. A row began in the, quote, bloody old Sixth," unquote, by the breaking of some ballot boxes, both parties armed with stones and bludgeons, and turned the scene into one of violence. The riot became general. A crowd, composed chiefly of Whigs, ransacked gun shops in Broadway and made for the state arsenal at Elm and Franklin Streets. Rumors of their intentions spreading, a gathering of peaceably inclined citizens arrived before them and held the arsenal until the militia hastened there and restored order. Cornelius W. Lawrence, the Tammany candidate, was declared elected by 181 votes out of a total of nearly 35,000 over Julian G. Verplanck, who had gone over to the Whigs. Verplanck never ceased to contend that he had been defrauded of the office. The Whigs obtained a majority in the Common Council, 17 members to the Wigwam's 15, and joyfully said that Tammany Hall, in electing the mayor, had the shadow, while they, in securing the corporation, had the substance. With the Common Council, they could carry the whole patronage of the city, amounting to more than $1 million a year. This election demonstrated clearly that the propertied classes as a whole were combined against the laborers, mechanics, farmers, and producing classes generally, and that they were as much concerned over the spoils of office as was the most rabid Tammany man. As a protest against the indifference of the local leaders of both parties to the real interests of the people, and to put a stop to the granting of special privileges, the Equal Rights Party now came into existence. Chapter 12. The Equal Rights Party, 1834 to 1837. The Equal Rights Movement, which began its activity inside the Tammany organization, was virtually a moral, then a political, revival of the Working Men's Party. Its principles, however, were less radical, and its demands more moderate. It advocated the equal rights of every citizen in his person and property and in their management, declared unqualified and uncompromising opposition to banknotes as a circulating medium, because gold and silver were the only safe and constitutional currency, and a like opposition to all monopolies by legislation. It also announced hostility, quote, to the dangerous and unconstitutional creation of vested rights by legislation, because these were a usurpation of the people's sovereign rights, unquote, and asserted that all laws or acts of incorporation passed by the legislature could be rightfully altered or repealed by its successors. The Equal Rights Movement comprised men of various classes. Moses Jacques and Levi D. Slam were its principal leaders. To comprehend its nature, a brief review of the causes which conspired to bring it into being will be necessary. Up to 1831, the repeal of the law for the imprisonment of debtors had been a subject of almost constant agitation by reformers and working men. Under this law, more than 10,000 persons, mainly unfortunate laborers, were imprisoned annually in loathsome prisons, without inquiry as to their innocence or guilt, lying there at their creditor's will, unsupplied by the city with any of the necessities of life. Tammany Hall had taken no action until 1831, when its leaders gave a belated approval to a bill introduced in the Assembly abolishing imprisonment for debts of any sum except in the cases of non-residents. This bill had become a law in that year, yet by 1833 the interest of Tammany's chiefs in the working man had died away to such an extent that the Assembly was allowed to pass a measure entitled, quote, "a law abolishing imprisonment for debt," unquote, but reinstituting imprisonment on all debts under $50, thus completely nullifying the law so far as the poor were concerned. The measure failed to become a law, but the sharp practice shown in its wording and in the measures taken to push it through the Assembly disgusted the equal rights men, and in their meetings they passed resolutions denouncing the chiefs responsible therefor. Their resolutions furthermore declared that the proceedings at Tammany Hall were a sealed book, that a few men, William Paxson Hallett, Elisha Tibbets, J.J. Roosevelt, and John Y. Sebra, made up important nominations in Wall Street after the bankers had decided upon the candidates, and then had the nominating committee accept them. Popular disaffection was increased by the manner in which the legislature and the aldermen continued to create corporations with enormous grants. The scandals over the procedure of legislative charters, particularly bank charters, had for more than 25 years aroused a growing indignation among the people. In 1805, shortly after the passage of the Merchants' Bank Charter, Peter Betts, an assemblyman, declared in open session of the lower house that Luke Metcalf, a fellow member, had sought to bribe him to vote for the measure. The price promised was 15 shares of the bank's stock, valued at $50 each. Conflicting testimony was given on the matter, and a motion was made to expel Metcalf. The House, however, retained him in his seat by a vote of 87 to 16. Charges of the same kind, affecting practically every session of the legislature, were common, though only occasionally were they made the subject of official investigation. In 1812, however, shortly after the Assembly, forced by public criticism, had passed a resolution compelling each member to pledge himself that he had neither taken nor would take, quote, "any reward or profit, direct or indirect, for any vote on any measure," unquote. Another scandal arose. The Bank of America, with very moderate assets of any sort, received a charter on a stated capitalization of $6 million, an enormous sum in those days. Charges of corruption were bandied about. One assemblyman, Silas Holmes, declaring under oath that the sum of $500, quote, "besides a handsome present," unquote, had been offered him. A committee of the lower house listened to testimony in the case, and then, by a decisive majority, voted that the body was above suspicion. But in a pronunciamento to Governor Tompkins during the same year, the same House graciously reported, quote, "We are well aware that the number of charters for banking institutions already granted has awakened general solicitude and anxiety," unquote. The Chemical Bank was a more modern instance. The report of the Joint Legislative Committee in 1824 had shown that its promoters set apart $50,000 worth of stock at par value to buy the votes of members. General Swartwout, he who had defaulted for $68,000 in 1820, acting as one of the lobbyists and claiming $5,000 for his services. Other scandals throwing strong light on legislative practices were those of the Aetna and Chatham fire insurance companies. It's always insurance companies and bankers. The testimony brought out in the investigation of these companies in 1826 showed that William J. Waldron, one of the line of grand sachems, gave $20,000 in certificates of stock to General Jasper Ward, a state senator, and $20,000 more to various other persons to get the Aetna Charter through the legislature. The Chatham Charter, passed in 1822, cost $20,000 in stock at par value, additional sums being paid for the passage of certain amendments in 1824. Ward wrote from Albany to a friend in the city, complaining that the Jefferson Fire Insurance Company, which secured a charter at the same time, 1824, had paid only 5% of what it had promised, giving notes for the remainder. These were but a few examples of the general legislative corruption. The men who profited by these charters brought about, in 1830, the exemption of bank stock in the city from taxation. That nearly every Tammany leader held bank stock was proved by the testimony before an investigating committee in June 1833, which set forth how the organizers of the newly founded 7th Ward Bank had distributed thousands of shares among over 100 state and city office holders, both Tammany and anti-Masonic. Every Tammany senator was involved. James Perkins, the principal lobbyist for the charter, swore repeatedly that $5,000 in stock at par value had been taken directly by state senators, and from $10,000 to $25,000 in stock distributed indirectly. Perkins charged Thurlow Weed with accepting a $500 bribe. The investigating committee reported finally that it could find no proof involving any but one of the accused. Same old bogus committee, just designed to let some heat out of the kitchen and slap the wrist of one patsy. As the bill for the charter had originally passed the Senate by a vote of 27-2, and as the members of the investigating committee had been chosen from this majority, its conclusions were naturally viewed with a good deal of suspicion. The equal rights men complained that 75% of the whole of the banknotes circulating in New York City consisted of depreciated paper. The circulation of these in notes of $5 or under amounted, by March 1835, to nearly $1,500,000. One establishment alone, whose weekly payroll in 1834 amounted to $40,000, paid the greater part of this sum in depreciated notes. The wage earner was in constant fear that Any morning he might wake to hear that the bank whose notes he held had failed. Frequently, the worst deceptions on the public were connived at by the officials. The Hudson Insurance Company, for instance, with a nominal capital of $200,000, was permitted to issue bonds to the amount of $800,000 upon the most fictitious resources. This was far from being an isolated instance. The law allowed a bank with only $100,000 capital to loan $250,000, thus receiving interest on more than twice the capital actually invested. The council was more than ever a hotbed of venality. Numberless small, quote-unquote, jobs were perpetrated without public notice. But when it was proposed in October 1831 to give the Harlem Railroad Company the franchise for the perpetual and exclusive use of Fourth Avenue, free of all payment to the city, Alderman George Sharp, one of the few public-spirited members, drew general attention to the matter by an energetic denunciation. After every other means had been resorted to, without success, to influence his vote, he was told that he would be excluded from the party by certain persons at Tammany Hall. Alderman Stevens, who declared that he had seen stock given to members of the board and to the quote-unquote core editorial to secure their influence, was also threatened. The words of these two men proved conclusively the truth of what for a long time was common report, that the group of Tammany leaders not only controlled the party nominations, but threatened public officials with their displeasure, with all which that implied: exile from public life, loss of political influence, perhaps ruin of fortune, and this in case they did not vote for certain measures whose quote-unquote merits were recommended to them. The laborer had other grievances. For 17 years the council had refused to grant any additional ferries between New York City and Brooklyn. During that period, the population of New York had increased 150,000, and that of Brooklyn 15,000. This growth involved a vast amount of marketing and increased the business intercourse between the two places more than fourfold. The lessees of the Fulton Ferry, the Soul Ferry, had made an agreement in 1811, it was alleged, with the New York City Corporation, by which the latter undertook to bind itself not to establish any additional ferries from south of Catherine Street to the village of Brooklyn for 25 years. The exactions of the water, gas, and steamboat monopolies likewise had a share in causing the formation of the Equal Rights Party. Besides the dispensing to favored knots of citizens of trading privileges and immunities which were withheld from the great body of the community, the laboring element believed that there was a gross inequality of taxation in the interests of the rich. Same old, same old. Taxes rose from $550,000 in 1832 to $850,000 in 1833. But the increase fell upon, you guessed it, the poor. The Merchants' Bank was assessed at $6,000. The lot and building had cost that sum 20 years before, and were now worth at least twice as much. The Merchants' Exchange was assessed at $115,000, yet it was known that the land and building had cost $300,000. Dozens of like instances were cited by the reformers, and they now determined upon a concerted effort looking to better government. A powerful influence came to the aid of the equal rights men when William Cullen Bryant and William Leggett assumed the editorship of the Evening Post. The journal now advocated industrial and political reforms with singular independence and ability. It revived the original conception of the nominating committee's functions. It urged the electors to remember that the nomination by a nominating committee was but a recommendation to the people of certain candidates whose merits and qualifications were as fair a matter of discussion as any under heaven, and that it was for this purpose that nominations were made so long before the great popular meeting was convened. Besides his editorial support of the movement, Leggett participated in the practical work of its organization and management. The clear thought and definite expression shown in most of the equal rights manifestos and resolutions are perhaps directly due to him. The equal rights faction became especially active in the fall of 1834. Its orators raised such a stir that both Tammany Hall and the Whigs suddenly developed an astonishing care for the working men. To conciliate them, the Tammany Nominating Committee exacted a written pledge from every one of its candidates requiring an expression of his sentiments on the monopoly question. To counteract the wigwam, the Whigs gathered a meeting of quote-unquote Whig mechanics at Masonic Hall, October 14th, at which opposition to monopolies, especially banking monopolies, was declared. Not to be outdone, the wigwam got together a meeting of quote-unquote democratic mechanics who resolved to oppose monopolies and to restore the constitutional currency. Tammany also began to recognize, even more liberally than before, the naturalized citizens. As a consequence, it won the fall 1884 election by over 2,300 majority, most of the equal rights men voting with it. 1/3 of its 18,000 voters were estimated at this time to be of foreign birth. Nearly all the Tammany assemblymen proceeded to forget their pledges, only 4 of the delegation voting in the February following against the bill, giving exclusive privileges to the Peconic Company. The first clash between the equal rights faction and the Tammany monopolists occurred at a meeting at the wigwam on March 31st, 1835. Certain that the aldermen would never grant additional ferries, the equal rights men favored a measure, then pending in the legislature, for the establishment of a state board of commissioners clothed with that power. Gideon Lee, a Wall Street banker, called the meeting to order and nominated Preserved Fish for chairman. Is that a name? Preserved Fish? No way. many objections were uttered, and Fish retired. The radicals howled down the Tammany speakers and ran the meetings themselves, adopting resolutions prepared by Joel P. Seaver, declaring for the creation of the State Board. A bill for a new ferry, the present South Ferry, was passed the same year. The equal rights men still hoped to gain their ends inside the organization. When Cornelius W. Lawrence stood for re-election as mayor in April 1835, there was scarcely any opposition to him from any quarter, he receiving 17,696 votes out of a total of 20,196. In the fall of 1835, however, the Tammany Nominating Committee recommended the state office's candidates of a character most obnoxious to the equal rights men, and called a meeting for the evening of October 29th to ratify its nominations. Barely were the doors opened when the equal rights men rushed in and frustrated an attempt to place Isaac L. Varian in the chair. In the melee, the Bank Democrats, finding themselves unable to control the meeting, withdrew, but in doing so turned off the gas, leaving the equal rights men in total darkness. The trick must have been anticipated, for each man drew forth a candle and a lucifer or locofoco match, and in a twinkling the hall was resplendent with dancing lights. The equal rights men adopted resolutions and a suitable ticket of their own. 3 sets of candidates stood for election: the Native Americans, who opposed the election of foreigners to office and urged the repeal of the naturalization laws, took the place of the Whigs. In the face of this strong sentiment, Tammany Hall acted with its usual diplomacy. The General Committee boasted that the regular Tammany ticket was composed of only Native Americans, which was true, the naturalized citizens having been cajoled on the promise of receiving the usual quota among nominations the next year. Of the nearly 23,000 votes cast at the election, Tammany Hall obtained an average majority of about 800. The Native Americans polled 9,000 votes, and the equal rights men or anti-monopolists over 3,500. It was estimated that 2,000 Whigs voted the Tammany ticket to defeat the anti-monopolists, and that about 5,500 Whig votes were divided between Tammany Hall and the Native Americans. The news of its slight plurality was hailed with anything but pleasure at the wigwam, where the anti-monopolists were denounced as political swindlers and adventurers. Instead, however, of making a show of outward fairness, the organization leaders blindly took the course most adapted to fan the flames of opposition to themselves. After the Great Fire of 1835, which destroyed $20 million worth of property, and the extent of which was due to the refusal of the corrupt aldermen to give the city a proper water supply, the Common Council agreed to loan $6 million at 5% interest for the relief of insurance companies and banks. Which sound familiar? They're going to give money to the insurance companies and banks which had suffered from the fire. The hell with people. Same thing. We're going to bail out General Motors and what Was it Gold Sachs? Oh, the bankers who gave the finger to Congress. Goldman Sachs. Yeah, we're going to bail those guys out. That's always gone on in America. Continuing. Nothing was said or done for the relief of the poor sufferers, whom the wigwam claimed to have under its especial protection. The council allowed pawnbrokers 25% interest and prohibited them from loaning more than $25 on a single pledge. The city institutions were in a melancholy state. Most serious of all, on the public mind, were the disclosures concerning the commercial bank, from which funds were embezzled in the scheme of cornering the stock of the Harlem Railroad. As a step towards this end, Samuel Swartwout and Garrett Gilbert, a sometime sachem, lobbied for the passage of a bill to increase the capital stock of this road, which, in turn, it was thought, would increase the price of all the stock. Two senators agreeing to raise objections temporarily, quote, so as to blind the eyes of New Yorkers, unquote. The leaders made no effort to stop the granting of charters or to curtail the monopolist privileges already granted. It was admitted generally that no legislation even remotely affecting the interests of the banks could pass without the consent of those institutions. Tradesmen also had their combinations, but combinations legal enough when organized by capital were declared illegal when formed by working men. At this time, the Supreme Court of the State of New York decided that combinations to raise the wages of any class of laborers amounted to a misdemeanor, on the ground that they were injurious to trade. Later, in June 1836, 20 tailors were found guilty of conspiracy under that decision and fined by Judge Edwards $1,150 in the aggregate for engaging in a strike for higher wages. The mechanics prepared to hold an indignation meeting and applied for permission to use Tammany Hall. This was refused by the sachems. In defiance of the wigwam, the meeting, a gathering of 20,000 persons, was held in the park fronting Tammany Hall. Quote, our working men, unquote, read the address of the committee of this meeting, free in reality when they dare not obey the first instinct of all animated beings, when our courts pronounce it criminal to exercise nature's paramount law of self-preservation. Trades unions and mechanic societies are only self-protective against the countless combinations of aristocracy, boards of bank and other chartered directories, boards of brokers, boards of trade and commerce, combinations of landlords, coal and wood dealers, monopolists, and all those who grasp at everything and produce nothing. If all these combinations are suffered to exist, why are trades unions and combinations of working men denounced? Should they not have an equal chance in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness? Should they not have an equal right with the other classes of society in their person, in their property or labor, and in their management, unquote? Man, that reminds me of the part in 1984 of The Book Within a Book, supposedly written by Emanuel Goldstein, where Orwell really breaks it down succinctly, how all through history you have three classes of people, the upper, middle, and lower, and both the middle and the lower, And all of history, of course, the lower ones want to rise, but are too stupefied by poverty to ever do so. So they're out of the picture. They're like animals. But the middle, and I suppose lower middle, but the middle always seeks to rise above to the upper. But the upper always passes laws and always makes it look legitimate, of course. Makes it legal, but always keeps the foot on the neck of the middle. And that's all this is. Trades unions and mechanic societies are illegal, but all of these other combinations of landlords and bankers, boards of brokers, monopolists, that's okay. You see what's going on there. Continuing. The meeting, in strong resolutions, condemned the Supreme Court decision and that of Judge Edwards. At this moment, the peculiar wigwam methods were being displayed in another direction to an edified public. In the first days of May, 1836, the Board of Aldermen found itself equally divided. Tammany Hall and the Whigs, each having 8 votes, precluding either from electing a president. The Tammany members, in the tea-room downstairs, made merry over refreshments. The Whigs could not muster a quorum, and sent word to the organization men to appear. The wigwam men replied that they didn't choose, and bade the Whigs come to them. Meanwhile, the public business stood still. Finally, the balloting was begun. On May 23rd, 17 votes were found to have been cast, although there were only 16 voting aldermen. Oh, boy. By the end of May, more than 120 ballots were had. At last, on July 1st, the Tammany men persuaded Alderman Ward, a Whig, to offer a resolution electing Isaac L. Varian, a wigwam candidate, for the first 6 months, which was done. Taking these proceedings as a cue, the Equal Rights Party on June 6th, at Military Hall, adopted a long series of resolutions stating that the aristocracy of the democracy, or in other words, the monopolists, the paper currency Democrats, the partisans of the quote-unquote usages, had long deceived and misguided the great body of the Democrats. Through these quote-unquote usages, the tools of the banks and other incorporated and speculative interests were enabled to take advantage of the unsuspicious self-security of the people, both before and at primary meetings. By the aristocracy and through secret caucuses, candidates were chosen, proceedings were cut and dried, and committees were packed. When committees could not be packed without opposition, the resolutions further read, 2 sets of committee men were usually elected, and that set, whose political complexion best suited the packed majority of the General Committee, was always accepted without any regard to the majorities of the people. The Union did not furnish a more dangerous usurpation upon the sovereignty of the people than the fact of the Tammany Hall Nominating Committee sending recently a petition to the legislature in favor of chartering more banks and banking paper capital and designating themselves not as citizens, but as members of the nominating committee, notwithstanding the very nominees of such a committee had given their written pledge to oppose new banks and monopolies. The quote-unquote usages, the Equal Rights Party next resolved, so productive of secret caucuses, intrigues, and abuses, furnished the avenue through which one portion of the democracy had been corrupted, and the other portion, the great mass, led astray. The latter was taught to believe that quote-unquote usages alone made men Democrats, and that to keep Federalists and Whigs out of office was the very essence of democracy. The Equal Rights Party then nominated Isaac L. Smith of Buffalo for governor, and Moses L. Jacques of New York City for lieutenant governor. To draw from the strength of the new party, some of the Tammany's leaders, Samuel Swartwout, Jesse Hoyt, Stephen Allen, Saul Alley, and a few others, professed to favor the repeal of the restraining law, which in effect prohibited private banking and gave the incorporated institutions a monopoly. The anti-monopolists were not to be deluded. On September 21st, they declared that in the recent professions of the Tammany corruptionists, in advocating this repeal, and in favoring some other few minor democratic measures, they beheld the stale expedient of luring the bone and sinew of the country to the support of their monopoly and banking men and measures, and that they had no faith in Tammany quote-unquote usages, policy, or its incorrigible sachems. The characters of most of the wigwam nominations were so tainted that it seemed as if the candidates were put forward in defiance of the best public sentiment. It is not so certain that outside the Equal Rights Party the voters were repelled by the current methods of buying legislation and dictating nominations. A low tone of public morals was manifested. Men were bent on money-making. He who could get rich by grace of the legislature was thought, quote-unquote, smart and worthy of emulation. The successful in politics were likewise to be envied and, if possible, imitated. A large part of the community bowed in respect to the person of wealth, no matter whence came his riches, and the bank lobbyists were the recipients of a due share of this reverence. From these men, the Tammany leaders selected candidates. One of the Assembly nominees was Prosper M. Wetmore, who had lobbied for the notorious state bank charter. This bank, according to the charter, was to have $10 million capital, although its organizers did not have more than a mere fraction of that sum. This was going too far, even for Albany, though upon modifying their application, the charter was granted. Reuben Withers and James C. Stonall, bank lobbyists, Benjamin Ringgold, of course he's going to be a banker, Benjamin Ringgold, a bank and legislative quote-unquote go-between, so he's a briber, a lobbyist, and Morgan L. Smith, preeminent among lobbyists, were other Tammany nominees. Notwithstanding the low standards of public morals, these men were so unpopular that when the form of submitting their names for ratification to the great popular meeting at the Wigwam on November 1st, after it was carried out, a hostile demonstration followed. The names of Wetmore, Smith, and Ringgold especially were hooted, but the leaders had groups of quote-unquote whippers brought in hurriedly to vote affirmatively, and the presiding officer declared all the nominees duly accepted by the people. Only 6 of the organization's 13 nominees survived the popular wrath, and the nominees for nearly all the other offices were beaten, notwithstanding the expectation that the presidential election would carry them in on the party ticket. A number of Tammany men of principle refused to vote. The Whigs, the Native Americans, and some quote-unquote loco-focos joined forces. They were aided by the panic which, breaking out shortly before election, reacted against the Democrats. The Equal Rights men, as a rule, voted for Van Buren. Tammany Hall and the Whigs both committed, you guessed it, frauds. Van Buren received 1,124 majority in New York City, which in 1832 had given Jackson nearly 6,000 majority. Made wiser by defeat, the organization leaders realized the importance of the Equal Rights Movement and caused, as a sop, the passage in February 1837 of the bill repealing the Restraining Act. The Common Council likewise modified the Pawnbrokers Act by cutting down the interest to a more reasonable percentage. Their providence stopped at this point, however, and during the panic winter following, neither the legislature nor Common Council did anything to alleviate the miseries of the poor. On the contrary, the poor complained that the tendency more and more was to use the power of the law to make the rich richer. While the suffering was greatest, Alderman Aaron Clark, a Whig who had made his fortune from lotteries, proposed that the city spend several millions of dollars to surround its waterfront with a line of still water ponds for shipping purposes, his justification for this expenditure being that the North River piers would, quote, raise the price of every lot 5 by 100 feet west of Broadway $5,000 at a jump, unquote. Quote, millions to benefit landowners and shippers, but not a dollar for the unemployed hungry, unquote, exclaimed the anti-monopolists. Alderman Bruin, another Whig, at a time when the fall in the value of real estate in New York City alone exceeded $50,000, suggested the underwriting by the city to the speculators for the sum of $5 million to take in pledge the lands they had bought and to give them the bonds of the city for 2/3 their value. To the Equal Rights men there was not much difference between the Tammany Hall and the Whig leaders. Both, it was plain, sweated the people for their own private interests, although the Whigs, inheriting the Federalist idea that property was the sole test of merit, did not flaunt their undying concern for the laborer so persistently as did the wigwam. The city in 1837 was filled with the homeless and unemployed. Rent was high, and provisions were dear. Some things never change, huh? Cattle speculators had possession of nearly all the stock, and a barrel of flour cost $12. On February 12th, a crowd met in the City Hall Park, after which over 200 of them sped to the flour warehouse of Eli Hart and Company on Washington Street. This firm, and that of S.B. Herrick and Son, it was known, held a monopoly in the scarce supply of flour and wheat. The doors of Hart's place were battered down, and nearly 500 barrels of flour and 1,000 bushels of wheat were taken out and strewn in the street. Herrick's place likewise was mobbed. On May 10th, when the banks suspended specie payments, a vast and excited crowd gathered in Wall Street, and a riot was narrowly averted. The Equal Rights Party could not be bought out or snuffed out. To deprive it of its best leaders, Tammany Hall resorted to petty persecution. Jacques and Slam had headed a petition to the legislature protesting against the appointment of a certain suspicious bank investigating committee. The Wigwam men in the legislature immediately secured the passage of a resolution for the appointment of a committee to investigate this petition, and this committee instantly hailed Jacques and Slam to appear at Albany and give testimony. The purpose was plain. The Tammany men sought to have the equal rights leaders at Albany, which was not as accessible from the city as now, and there keep them under various pretexts while the spring campaign for mayor was going on. Jacques and Slam did not appear and were adjudged guilty of contempt. When they were most needed in New York City, they were arrested and arraigned before the legislature. William Leggett also was threatened, but escaped arrest. The Equal Rights Party, however, was soon to demonstrate its capacity to do harm to Tammany. The organization nominated John J. Morgan for mayor. The Whigs named Aaron Clark, and the Equal Rights Party opposed them with Jacques. The 3,911 votes Jacques received were enough to defeat Morgan, with his 12,974 votes against Clark's 16,140. Worst blow of all, Tammany Hall lost the Common Council. When the new body came in, it removed all of the wigwam's office holders that it could. The spoils in the form of annual salaries paid by the city, amounting to $468,000, the perquisites and contracts, such as that for the Croton Aqueduct, in favor of which the people had voted some years before, and other improvements, all went to the Whigs. The Tammany men, regarding the equal rights men responsible for this loss of power, were now disposed to treat with them, and willing enough to throw over the banker corporation element. And that concludes this installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gus Myers. And this has been, and still is, and forever and always will be, Rejected Knowledge.